Well, hello there, everyone, and welcome to a new ASMR series where I'm actually going to be reading the Great American Air Race. It's going to be an ASMR style book reading, so if you guys are interested in a story, this book is about a race across America, and I'm a pilot, so I saw airplane, I had to pick it up. Now, we're only going to be reading a few chapters each episode, trying to keep it around an hour tops. So, hope you guys enjoy, though. Let me know what you guys want in future videos. So, The Great American Air Race by John Lancaster. And it's going to be soft spoken. How about today? We try to get through part 1, which is 9 chapters. We have a map of the air race across the United States. Let me check the chapter real quick. Prologue. The snow came on suddenly, as it often does in Wyoming high county, all but blinding 2 aviators in their wooden fabric biplane hunched in the open front cockpit. Lieutenant Edward V. Wales reduced power and descended within a few hundred feet of the ground, where the visibility was slightly better. But there was little room to spare beneath the clouds. As soon as the aircraft leveled off, the terrain started to rise. Wales advanced the throttle and began a slow climb before leaving Rawlins some 20 minutes earlier. Wales and the man rode in the cockpit behind him. Lieutenant William Goldsborough had decided to fly direct compass line to the temporary airfield at Fort D.A. Russell in Cheyenne on the far side of Medicine Bow Mountains. They briefly had considered a safer route along the Union Pacific Railroad tracks, which ran north of the highest peak before veering south towards Laramie and Cheyenne, but the detour would cost them valuable time, another 40 minutes or so at least, and the two were in a hurry. Now Wales was having second thoughts. The blizzard showed no sign of abating, and he knew the tallest mountains were still ahead. Better to follow the railroad after all. He banked the DH-4 into a left turn, flattened the wings on a new compass, heading to the north. Neither man was worried. They could still see the ground. They were making good progress. It wouldn't be long before they picked up the railroad, and with it an unobstructed path across the prairie towards Cheyenne, where fuel and food awaited. They could only make up the lost time in the next couple of legs. With a tailwind and a bit of luck, they might even reach Omaha by sunset. In the meantime, Wales was careful to maintain an even distance between the biplane and the moderate uphill slope. Did I? No, I didn't. Okay, good. At more than 8,000 feet above sea level, the air was bitingly cold, but aviators were used to it by now. An isolated ranch house passed beneath their wings, glimpsing a group of cattlemen into the snow. Goldsman stuck an arm out of the cockpit and gave them a friendly wave. The cowboys heard the thunder of the big V-12, and if they were close enough, they would recognize the tricolor roundos of the U.S. Army Air Service. It was early in the afternoon of October 9th, 1919. A little more than 24 hours earlier, the two flyers had departed San Francisco on the first leg of a great advance, a coast-to-coast airplane race, the likes of which the world had never seen. As conceived by William Billy Mitchell, the brass, sharp-elbowed brigadier general and war hero who one day be celebrated as the father of the U.S. Air Force. The reliability and endurance tests, as a race officially be known, would be an unprecedented, not only in length and duration, but also in number of participants. More than 60 airplanes divided into the groups, one on Long Island, the other in San Francisco, would take off from opposite coasts some 2,700 miles distant, crossing the middle and competing for the fastest flying and elapsed times. It was a bold and risky undertaking, though the race was open to only qualified military aviators. None of the men who had signed up had attempted a journey of such improbable length, and for good reason. Like all aircraft of the day, the surplus warplanes they would fly were almost comically ill-suited for the long-distance travel, or arguably for any travel at all. The open cockpits offered a scant protection against wind and cold. The engine noise was quite literally deafening. Engines were unreliable and sometimes caught fire in flight. Crude flight instruments were of marginal value to pilots trying to keep their bearings in clouds and fog, but that was only part of the challenge. The route across the country was almost entirely lacking in permanent airfields or any form of aviation infrastructure. There was no radar, air traffic control system, or radio network. Weather forecasts were rudimentary and often wrong. In the absence of electronic beacons or formal aviation charts, pilots followed railroad tracks or compass headings that wandered drunkenly at every turn. Every hour or so, they hoped that they would land at one of 20 controlled stops between the coast. Most were makeshift dirt or grass fields that had already been hastily demarked and stocked with fuel, spare parts, other supplies, just hours before the start of the race. Despite these slapdash preparations, Mitchell and his colleagues in the air service decided that the last minute to double the length of the race. Instead of a one-way flight between the coasts, it'd be a round-trip journey of 5,400 miles. It was as if, in the absence of anything resembling a national air transportation system, Mitchell decided simply to will one into being. His motives were nakedly political. Though to give birth to the airplane, the United States had been a latecomer to World War I and had fallen behind Europe in aviation, as clashing armies complained for dominance of the air over the Western Front. Now, as the United States rushed to demobilize, Mitchell feared that his long-term security was at risk, and the country needed a robust aviation industry to fulfill both military and commercial needs. Part of the solution, he believed, was a cabinet-level Department of Aeronautics to include an independent Air Force, called for by several bills pending in Congress. He also sought to protect the Air Service from the worst post-war budget cuts. A gifted showman, Mitchell conceived the race as a stunt to demonstrate the transformation potential of aviation, and rallied the public behind his goals in Washington. To that end, he had a really powerful ally in Otto Prager, driven, somewhat ruthless Texan, who ran fledgling U.S. air mail service and embraced the contest as a prelude to a transcontinental air mail route. In one sense, at least, Mitchell's timing was good. Despite the victory in Europe 11 months earlier, the country was fearful, anxious, and in need of a little distraction. The influenza pandemic, which ultimately would kill about 675,000 Americans, only recently begun to recede. Many cities were still in turmoil as Navas mobs, fueled by racism and anti-communist paranoia, visited their fury on immigrants, unions, especially African Americans, several hundred of whom who were during the so-called Red Summer in 1919. I am purposely going to censor some of the words in here for monetization purposes. And Washington was rife with rumor and speculation over the health of President Woodrow B. Wilson, who recently suffered a stroke. Against that backdrop, the contest came as a welcome respite, an irresistible pageant of grit, daring, and skill that would play out over many days and 1,000 miles. The press certainly covered in that way their borders, telling the world's greatest air race, or something simply, the Air Derby, was a sporting event as compelling as a World Series, which was underway as the race began. The daily box scores ranked pilots by their flying times on each leg. Photos of the grinning airmen next to the machines appeared in newspapers across the country. New York Times ran more than 30 stories on the contest. 8 of them were on the front page. As news of the competition spread, crowds at some control shops along the route grew so large that police were called in to keep them from interfering with takeoffs and landings. Library shelves were stripped of books on aeronautics. The country's fascination with the race owed as much to the contestants as it did to the novelty of the airplane. Reporters made much of the rivalries between them, these mythic, seemingly fearless birdmen. Among them were ordinary Baptist minister whose German police dog shared the rear cockpit with his mechanic, swaggering, cigar-smoking, former track star flew with the crutches in the cockpit and a metal brace on his leg he had shattered in a crash in France. And several combat aces, one of the general's son who managed twice to escape from German imprisonment after he was shot down behind enemy lines. For the duration of the race, and sometimes beyond, these contestants would attain celebrity to rival that of sports heroes and silent film stars. None could doubt their courage. Before it finally ended at the sunset of October 31st, 9 men would be victims of unseasonably bad weather or lapse in judgment or skill, sometimes in combination. It was a shocking toll, apart from the dozens who dropped out of the race because of the accidents, mechanical problems, or sheer exhaustion. In the end, a spectacle designed to promote safety and reliability of air travel arguably did the opposite. Some editorialists all but accused Mitchell of. Yet there is no denying the aviators' role as pioneers in the same tradition as Charles A. Lindbergh are the first astronauts. As they hopscotch from one improvised airfield to another, they blazed the trail for the first crude version of the transcontinental air route. Just 11 months later, the U.S. Post Office inaugurated its coast-to-coast airmail service along it, essentially the same path, fulfilling Prager's dream and opening the door to commercial air travel. Henry H. Hap Arnold, a Mitchell contemporary who helped organize the race, later commanded U.S. Air Forces in World War II, and one day described the contest as a foundation for commercial aviation in the United States. The contest came at a critical time in American aviation. Though the airplane was shown as potential war, it had not been yet to prove its utility in peacetime. Airmail was still in its infancy, except for a few short-lived experiments before World War I. Commercial passenger service had not been yet realized. At least civilian life, the airplane was little more than a curiosity, flown mostly by the gypsy flyers. They are known as barnstormers, who, out living at the fairgrounds, or borrow pastures, where they put on air shows or carry passengers on $15 joyrides, which was a lot of money back then. But the race between the coasts cast aviation in an entirely new light. The chain of designated airfields spanned the continent, the communication and logistics network that tied them together, the great distances covered by the flyers, the regular arrivals and departures all foreshadowed the rapidly approaching age of modern air travel. Nearly 8 years before Lindbergh's electrifying flight from New York to Paris, in the spirit of St. Louis, the transcontinental contest vividly demonstrated the airplane's potential as an instrument of everyday commerce. It was the opening of the latest, most thrilling chapter in a long quest to shrink the world. More than a century later, the transcontinental air race is all but forgotten. I haven't heard of it until a few years ago, when a gem book idea on airplane racing between the world wars led me to use a copy of Speed Seekers, an exhaustive look at the subject by Thomas G. Foxworth, that was published in 1976. Most of the book was focused on short races over closed courses, aerial equivalents of the Indianapolis 500, that drew huge crowds in the 1920s and 30s. But it included a short section on transcontinental race. Intrigued, I walked over to the Library of Congress near my home, Washington, D.C., and searched the electronic catalog for a book on the contest. I was a little surprised that I couldn't find one, Widening my net, I consulted other aviation histories, but with one or two exceptions, most ignored the subject or mentioned it only in passing. One of the best and most comprehensive accounts I could find was a master thesis submitted by a young Air Force officer, Ray L. Bowers, at the University of Wisconsin in 1960. I learned from old newspaper preserved on microfilm or in digital databases. As I read their stories on the contest, soaking up details of ice-covered wings, bulky engines, and tricky crosswing landings on dangerous fields, I became convinced that the race was worth more scrutiny than I received. It only signified a threshold moment in aviation history, but also it's a great adventure story, one that captured the actual experience of flying open cockpit biplanes in that era. The subject played to an abiding passion, although I spent most of my career as a news reporter, including 8 years as a foreign correspondent. I had a lifelong interest in airplanes and flying. As a child, I was an avid builder of model planes, and my bookshelves are filled with aviation-themed works by Ernest K. Gahn, Attorney de Saint-Exupéry, and other writers. The summer after graduating college, I fulfilled my boyhood fantasy of earning a private pilot's license, which I have, by the way. I love the challenge of flying and unparalleled sense of freedom it offered. Exhilarating to take off, gratifying squeak of my wheels on the asphalt when I made a smooth landing. I even toyed with the idea of flying as a career. That was a passing fancy. After taking my first newspaper job in Des Moines, I decided that there are better uses of my time and money than buzzing cornfields in a rented Cessna. But my fascination with airplanes and the people who flew them never waned. Transcontinental gave me a reason. My wife would call it an excuse to start flying again. I wanted to retrace the flight's original route as a part of my research, landing at the same towns and cities, flying low and slow, so I could see the country as they had. I signed up for flying lessons at a small airport outside Washington, D.C., where I slowly relearned my skills I had lost nearly over the 4 decades. Fun fact, your private pilot's license never expires. You just need to go do a flight review. Yes. After countless laps on traffic pattern, a lot of bounced landings, my instructor signed me off as competent to fly the small 2-seater I'd bought secondhand off a few months earlier. My flight across the country and back in the early summer 2019 went far more smoothly than it did for the aviators who covered the same distance a century earlier. This came as no surprise. Unlike its rickety cloth-covered forebears, my airplane had a carbon fiber fuselage, a reliable fuel-injected engine, an autopilot, a digital instrument panel, and that took the guesswork out of navigating, avoiding bad weather. Air traffic controllers guided me through crowded airspace and made sure I arrived safely at my destination. And if all else failed, I would have yanked the small handle beside my seat and deployed a parachute from a canister behind the cockpit. Cirrus pilot. This? What do you have? Oh yeah, he had a Cirrus. Those are parachutes. Attached to the airframe, the parachute designed to lower the plane gently to Earth, like a space capsule returning to orbit. This modern innovation increasingly a common feature of light aircraft and a big comfort of flying over water or rough terrain. But judgment and skill matter. And there was times when I was deficient in both, which led to several memorable scares. One caused by my failure to fully advance the throttle on takeoff. A cardinal sin that in other circumstances would have been my last. Every pilot has similar stories. The most important thing is to learn from them. They keep us humble. They remind us sometimes it all comes down to luck. Whales at Goldsboro were something in the vicinity of Oberg Pass when whales decided to deviate from the compass line and turn north in the direction of the railroad. The pass was broad, saddled between 2 moderate peaks. Pennock Mountain to the south and Code Mountain to the north. That in clear weather would have posed no threat, but now, with snow whipping past his cockpit, Wells could have barely made out the rocks and sagebrush just a few hundred feet below. The path was invisible. With only his compass and crude map to guide him, he had no way of knowing that the biplane was headed straight for the Cod Mountain. Wales realized this mistake too late, as the DH-4 neared the top of the 9,300-foot peak. Dark trees and scrub emerged through the veil of the snow. The plane was 200 feet above the rocky gulch, with only a second or two to react. Wales attempted to turn away, stepping on the rudder bar, shoving the stick to one side, but the plane was flying too slow for its wings to maintain lift and turn. On the telltale shudder of an aerodynamic stall, the DH-4 dropped his nose. After the first revolution of a spin, Wales was out of options. He did not have the time or altitude to recover. The men could only watch as the mountain rushed to meet them. Now, I am going to cut this short because I do want to go get something from the store before it closes. But I gotta say, this really interests me. It's interesting to see that the author actually traveled the country to write this story, and it is very interesting to me. I'm almost done my instrument rating at this point to see that these aviators are able to navigate based off of just visual reference, staying a couple hundred feet above the ground, because they didn't really have instrument flight rules back then. It was just all visual, and airplanes are just kind of like military and then like novelty, like the author said. So let me know what you guys think of this video. If you like it, hit that subscribe button, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. Next time I'll try to read a little bit more, maybe do a couple chapters. I don't know. Let me know what your perfect length is. I try to keep it under an hour, but yeah. So, the Great American Air Race. Let me know. You want more or no? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching. Bye.